Welcome! Today, we're going to untangle a centuries-old royal mystery. It's the story of a boy king whose reign, which should have been so promising, was cut tragically short. And it's left behind a legacy of really tough, unanswered questions.
So, we're diving into a really fascinating but sad piece of history from Korea's Joseon Dynasty. It's all about the life and the very questionable death of its sixth king, Danjong. You see, he became king as just a boy, with every possible advantage, but he was just swept away by this tide of ambition and betrayal.
To really get why his end was so tragic, we have to start at his very lonely beginning. You know, Danjong's story kicks off with so much promise, but things just took a turn against him, and fast.
I mean, just look at this lineage. He was born into the absolute top tier. He was the grandson of the legendary King Sejong the Great and the precious only son of King Munjong. In fact, he was the very first king in the entire history of the dynasty to inherit the throne directly, father to son, and his grandfather, Sejong, just adored him. There are even stories of him carrying the little prince around on his back. So he was, in every sense of the word, the perfect heir.
But that perfect picture just shattered. His mother died not long after he was born. His grandmother, who would have been this key figure, his protector, she also passed away. And then, the biggest blow of all, when he was only 12 years old, his father, King Munjong, died after just 2 years on the throne. So when he became king, he was utterly, tragically alone. There were no senior royals left to shield him from, the political predators circling the court.
And right into that power vacuum steps this ambitious, incredibly calculating figure, his own uncle, Grand Prince Suyang. Okay, so one of the very first things this new boy king had to deal with was a really important political task. He had to send what's called a gomyeongsa, an envoy mission to Ming China. Now, the whole point of this was to get the emperor's official stamp of approval for his rule. It was a really long, difficult journey, and honestly, it was a job that most people in the court desperately wanted to avoid.
And this is where Suyang makes an absolutely brilliant political move. He volunteers. He frames it so cleverly, like it's just this humble act of service. The king is young, I don't have a big job, so I can go. But what he was really doing was using this high-profile mission to build his own reputation, his own influence, both back home and with the very powerful Ming court. It was an incredibly shrewd move.
So with his influence growing and his power base getting stronger and stronger, Suyang decided it was time to make his move. And he did it with a swift and incredibly violent coup.
He really didn't waste any time. In an event that became known as the 계유정난 coup, Suyang literally stormed the home of Danjong's sister, where the young king was. He cornered this boy, accused his top advisors of treason, and demanded the royal seal. Just like that, in one single, brutal move, he wiped out his rivals and grabbed total control of the government. Not even 2 years later, a completely powerless Danjong was forced to give up the throne. I mean, this statement, supposedly from him, it just says everything, doesn't it? He entrusts the throne to his uncle of high virtue. It was a forced abdication, plain and simple. And Suyang took the throne for himself, becoming the new king, King Sejong. At this point, Danjong was given the title King Emeritus, which it's a king in name only, really. But a lot of his loyal followers just refused to accept what had happened. Their resistance was brave, for sure. But unfortunately, it would only end up sealing the young man's terrible fate.
The plots came one after another. First, in 1456, you had a group that history calls the Six Martyred Ministers. They tried to restore Danjong, but they were betrayed and brutally executed. Then, just a year later, another plot was uncovered, this time supposedly involving Danjong's own father-in-law. And right after that, a third plot, this one led by Danjong's other uncle, Prince Gumseng, was also exposed. It was relentless.
So King Sejong used these repeated plots as the perfect excuse to act. He stripped his nephew of all his royal status, demoting him from King Emeritus to the much lower Prince Nosan. Then he was banished to a place called Cheongyangpo, a really remote, isolated spot, surrounded by a river and steep cliffs. It wasn't just exile, it was basically a natural prison.
And you hear these heartbreaking stories that, in his loneliness, Danjong's only real companion was this single towering pine tree. People later named it Kwan Song, which means the see and hear pine, because it was the only thing there to witness all of the young prince's grief and his sorrow.
So finally, with all resistance crushed, and Danjong totally isolated, his fate was pretty much sealed. And this is where we get to the central and still unsolved mystery of this whole story. How did he actually die?
Well, the court started pushing for Danjong's death. Officials, even senior members of the royal family, were demanding it to stop any future rebellions. But interestingly, the official records, the Silic, show King Sejong pushing back, always deflecting and saying things like, "Let's not discuss this." Now, was that genuine hesitation, or was it just political theater? We really don't know. But what we do know is that very soon after, news of Danjong's death arrived from his exile.
And this is where the official story just completely falls apart. The records from Sejong's own reign claim it was suicide, that Danjong hanged himself because he was scared. But later versions of the very same royal annals tell a totally different story. One says he was poisoned by a royal order. Another adds this crazy detail about an emissary who hesitated to do it. And then an unofficial history says he was strangled from behind with a bowstring. So you have 4 different records with 4 very different causes of death, and all of them point away from suicide and directly towards murder. So what is the truth? Was it suicide, poison, or strangulation? We'll probably never know the exact grim details of his last moments. But these conflicting records, they leave us with this profound and honestly chilling question. How is history actually written? Is it really a record of what happened? Or is it just a reflection of what the people in power want us to believe? And that right there is the enduring mystery of the Boy King, whose tragic story still echoes all these centuries later.